7 years old, not 7 years old with a coach, not 7 years old with a training plan and a protein shake waiting at home. 7 years old, taken from your mother by the state, handed a single wool cloak, and told that everything soft in you needs to die before you're useful to anyone. The Spartans called this the agoge. 13 years of cold, hunger, controlled violence, and social pressure so total, it reshaped the nervous system at the exact age when the nervous system is still wet clay. By the time it was finished with you, you weren't a trained fighter. You were a different kind of human being than the one you would have become otherwise. Now picture Coronado, California, a man who has already passed some of the most demanding physical and psychological screening tests the modern military runs, is standing chest deep in 53-degree Pacific Ocean water at 2 in the morning, arms linked with the men beside him, being told to stay there. He's been awake for 38 hours. He'll be awake for another 44. He volunteered for this. He can quit by walking to a bell mounted nearby and ringing it 3 times. Most of them will. The ones who don't become Navy SEALs, the most comprehensively trained warriors the modern world produces. So, who's actually built better for combat? And I want to be careful here, because this question gets lazy answers very quickly. The lazy answer picks a side based on aesthetics. Either the romanticized Spartan warrior who belongs on a movie poster, or the modern operator bristling with gear and backed by every advantage sports science can provide. Neither of those answers is honest. The honest answer requires actually looking at what each system was trying to build, how it tried to build it, and what the biological record says about whether it worked. Let's start with time, because time is the variable that changes everything in this comparison, and almost nobody leads with it. Hell Week, the centerpiece of Navy SEAL selection, the thing that filters roughly 70% of already elite candidates, is 5 days and 18 hours long. 132 hours of sustained sleep deprivation, cold water exposure, and physical demand that accumulates faster than the body can recover from it. It is genuinely extraordinary. The men who get through it have demonstrated something real about their capacity to continue functioning when the body is screaming at them to stop. That's not nothing. That's actually rare. And it's genuinely difficult to train into a person in any other way. The agoge was 13 years long, and that gap, not in difficulty, but in duration and in the developmental window it occupied, is where the deepest biological differences start to live. Because what the Spartan system understood, without ever having the vocabulary of neuroscience to explain it, was that the nervous system of a 7-year-old is fundamentally different raw material than the nervous system of a 22-year-old. Childhood is when the brain's stress response systems are still being calibrated, still deciding, based on lived experience, what counts as a threat and what counts as normal Tuesday. The agoge fed 13 years of cold, hunger, social pressure, and physical pain directly into that calibration process during the exact window when the calibration is still happening. The result wasn't a man who had learned to tolerate discomfort. It was a man whose nervous system had been built, from its most plastic stage, with discomfort already classified as neutral information rather than emergency signal. That's a different kind of person, not tougher in the way we usually mean toughness, something more structural than that. Think about what chronic, mild hunger does to a developing body when it starts at age 7 and continues for years. The metabolic and hormonal adaptations that result aren't the same as the adaptations you see in an adult who diets aggressively. They're deeper. The body at that age is still writing its baseline settings, its reference points for what normal fuel availability looks like, how aggressively to defend fat stores, how much to prioritize cognitive and physical performance when calories are restricted. Spartan boys stole food as part of the training, not because the system was cruel for cruelty's sake, though it was also that, but because foraging under pressure, succeeding or failing at feeding yourself, was the training. The metabolic system that came out the other side had been configured from childhood to function on less, to maintain output under restriction, in a way that the adult body being pushed through a selection course simply cannot replicate at the same depth. Here's where I want to give the SEAL program its full credit, because I think the comparison is more interesting when both sides are taken seriously. What modern special operations has done, and done remarkably well, is systematize the production of a specific kind of warrior. The science behind SEAL training is real and has been refined through decades of iteration. The physical standards are evidence-based. The psychological screening tools identify genuine predictors of performance under sustained stress. The training pipeline compresses an enormous amount of stress inoculation into a relatively short window and produces operators who are genuinely exceptional at functioning inside complex, rapidly changing, high-stakes environments. The tactics, the equipment integration, the cognitive demands of modern special operations, a Spartan warrior would be overwhelmed by them immediately. The modern SEAL is doing things that require a kind of flexible, adaptive, information-dense decision-making that the Spartan system didn't train for, because the Spartan battlefield didn't require it. But here's the thing about the Spartan battlefield. It required something the modern training pipeline specifically and deliberately does not produce. A man for whom there is no gap between the training environment and the real environment, because the real environment was the training environment. The cold was real cold, not a controlled cold water tank. The hunger was real hunger, not a calculated caloric deficit. The social consequences of failure were real and permanent, not a bell you ring and then go home. By the time a Spartan warrior was 20, he had been living inside the actual conditions of his profession for 13 years, not simulating them, living in them. That's the line that modern training, for all its sophistication, cannot fully cross, because crossing it would mean starting with children, which is both illegal and wrong. The ethical ceiling on modern warrior development is set precisely where the Spartan system began, which means we will always be producing adult nervous systems that have been pushed hard, but never nervous systems that were built from the beginning for this specific purpose. Honestly, the part of this comparison that I keep coming back to isn't the physical data, it's the identity question. Spartan society didn't produce warriors as an output of a separate civilian society. It was a warrior society, meaning there was no version of a Spartan man's identity that existed outside of the military unit. The cohesion that created wasn't team bonding, it was something closer to what researchers now call identity fusion, where the individual's psychological sense of self becomes genuinely inseparable from the group's survival. Modern research on the highest performing SEAL platoons has found similar patterns developing during extended deployments. But the Spartan reached that state before he was 20 and lived inside it for his entire adult life. The SEAL reaches it during deployment and then returns to a civilian context that constantly pulls his identity in other direction. What does this actually mean for the person watching this who isn't going through Bud/S and wasn't raised in ancient Sparta? Here's what I keep landing on. Both systems, separated by 25 centuries of history and completely different civilizational contexts, were trying to solve the same problem. The problem of the gap. The gap between who you are in comfortable conditions and who you need to be when the conditions collapse. Every elite training system in human history has been an attempt to close that gap, to make the person who shows up in the worst conditions as close as possible to the person who shows up in the best ones. The methods differ enormously. The goal is identical. The Spartan method closed the gap by eliminating comfortable conditions entirely from childhood, so the gap never formed in the first place. The SEAL method closes it by compressing enormous stress into a short window in adulthood, pushing the nervous system to its existing limits and filtering for the people whose limits are highest. Both approaches produce something genuinely exceptional. Neither approach is fully available to most people, but the principle underneath both of them absolutely is. Because the gap closes the same way at every level, through accumulated exposure to the real condition, not the simulated one, not the comfortable version of training, the version that happens when you're tired, when you didn't sleep well, when it's cold, and you'd rather not. The version where the discomfort isn't the obstacle to the training, the discomfort is the training. Every time you wait for better conditions before you begin, you're widening the gap. Every time you train inside the uncomfortable conditions instead of postponing until they improve, you're narrowing it. The Spartans didn't have a different body than we do. They had a different relationship with the conditions their body was asked to operate in. That relationship was built over 13 years of deliberate, systematic exposure. Most of us can't replicate the duration or the depth, but every single one of us can start narrowing the gap today with whatever conditions we're actually in right now. The SEALs have a saying that gets used so often it's become a poster on a gym wall somewhere. But it's worth saying straight. Without the poster, get comfortable being uncomfortable. The Spartans didn't say it. They just started at age 7 and never stopped. Both paths lead to the same place. A person whose best self and worst conditions are finally genuinely close enough to trust. The question is which direction you're walking.